Hi everyone, my name is Hayden, and as you can tell by the title of this video, I will be playing through almost every fighting game ever made. I liked fighting games growing up, but I wasn't necessarily like a fan of them. I liked Smash Brothers, I liked Mortal Kombat. However, earlier this year, I just started getting this itch to play some old fighting games. I did eventually cave and I bought a fighting stick. It is a Hori Fighting Alpha. Here it is in all its glory. I got this because I don't know, it looked cool. It really made fighting games go from something I have kind of enjoyed for a while to, oh my gosh, I play these all the time now. Honestly, in the last few months, there's rarely a day goes by that I don't at least pop a fighting game on and play it for a little bit. I've just had a lot of fun with fighting games recently, and I just decided, you know what, I'm gonna actually take this a bit further. I'm gonna learn about the history of fighting games, I'm gonna go in depth on them, and eventually it turned into, I'm gonna make a video about this. Because the idea of playing almost every fighting game ever made from the beginning of the genre is a very daunting task. We'll be doing this in parts. This first part will cover 1976, which is generally considered the inception of the genre, to about late 1993, October or so. All of the game footage you see is recorded by me. Sometimes I'll show a news video or I'll show an actual recording of someone playing the game in the arcade, but for the most part, all of it's been recorded by me. I'm using emulation for the majority of the games that we're going to be talking about, and while emulation is awesome, I understand that sometimes it's not fully accurate, it's not fully to the original experience that you could have had. So if I say something negative about a game, take it with a grain of salt. Understand that this is just my personal experience. I'm not looking to dog on any of these 30-year-old games. I'm just here to talk on them and talk about my experience with them. So I think before we get into this, we should start with what is a fighting game, to me at least, and why do I say almost every fighting game? So from a super high level, I think a fighting game is a competitive game where the goal is to defeat the opponent or opponents. And by competitive, I don't necessarily mean like it's in esports or it's, you know, being considered the most balanced game ever. More so that you're 1v1, 2v2, 1v3, you know, you're versus each other, not 1v many, 1v infinite like most games are. Because of that, I won't be covering beat 'em ups in this video for the most part. They are important to the genre, they are cool, but I think they're enough to distinct themselves as their own category. For the most part, this includes beat 'em ups that have a versus mode or a beat 'em up that has some sort of boss fight that's kind of like a fighting game. Boxing games will not be included in this series. I think boxing games are different enough to justify themselves from traditional fighting games. For the most part, I won't be including wrestling games in this series. I kind of love wrestling games, that's nothing against them. I just think they're different enough. I think they distinct themselves enough. There are a few wrestling games that certainly cross over into the fighting game genre, and I'm going to talk about those, but just for the most part, if it's a straight wrestling game, if it's got stuff like pinning, I'm not going to be talking about it. And at least for this first part, my main focus is the arcade and the fighting game development that happened there, because a lot of console, a lot of PC games that were coming out in the 80s, they were just trying to replicate what was going on in the arcade. There are some exceptions that I'm going to talk about, but for the most part, just know I'm going to be talking about the arcade. If you're interested in some of the PC games or the console games that I skipped during this first part, there's a video series I use. It's a retrospective done by Magister Phaber. I did actually play a good amount of them, I just didn't have much to say about them. I'm not meaning to get super analytical about what is a fighting game and what isn't. I just wanted to give some clarification in case you were wondering why certain games were on this list. One last thing, I mentioned release dates in this video for the games that I'm talking about. Just know that I'm looking at the earliest release date possible, so that means if it came out in Japan a year or two before it came out everywhere else, I'm including that release date. With that out of the way, let's actually get into the list. Let's start talking about this. For the majority of the series, we're going to go year by year. However, I'm going to lump together 1976 to 1990 because while there are some important games here, there are some notable games that we're going to be discussing. It doesn't really get to a great fighting game in my opinion, a really stellar fighting game until 1991. That's really when the genre gets its legs and starts just blowing up and it hits the mainstream. Honestly, as this series continued, I played and invested in the games more and more. These early games, I don't really have a lot to say on. I'm going to talk about the mechanics they introduced, my experience with them a bit. But just know as the series goes on, I'm spending more and more time with the games, and so I'm able to talk on them more and more.
Electronic games have come a long way since Pong exploded on the scene a few years ago.
Heavyweight Champ is considered the first fighting game. It's very basic. It's pretty rudimentary. It came out in 1976. You can't actually play this game. It's lost even in terms of emulation. It was only in the arcades, and all we really have is like an auction that happened years ago. We have pictures of like the marquee, and we have this news footage that shows people playing it back in the day. It looked like a very simple game where you push this lever in and it punched either down or up. There's a video I'll put in the description that kind of covers this game and talks about it in a bit more detail if you're interested to hear more about it.
SEGA Center.
Warrior is considered the first commercially available fighting game. The backgrounds actually couldn't be displayed at the same time at the Knights, it just couldn't handle that. So they had to print the backgrounds in the actual arcade cabinet, so I've crudely recreated what it kind of looks like. It's very rudimentary, again, it's just like two knights that go against each other. It has vector-based graphics, which honestly look pretty cool. Karate Champ actually establishes a lot of the genre's trademarks. Best of 3 rounds, bonus stages, you can actually block by moving the stick in the opposite direction. You had 2 arcade sticks instead of buttons, so you actually controlled it by saying go up with the left stick and right on the right stick, and you'll do a down kick or something like that. There's no health bars in this game. It's scored by half a point or a point depending on the points you got in your hit. Another very important stepping stone to the lineage of fighting games, this game has a lot that it introduces to the genre. You can't block in this game, but it does introduce health bars. Each opponent has a unique fighting style. They might have a unique weapon. I've played this game a fair amount through this series, and it's pretty fun. I think the art style is pretty cute. There's this Xbox Live version that comes out in 2007 that doesn't really change anything gameplay-wise, but it has these updated graphics. There's a sequel that comes out in 1986, but it's more of a beat 'em up than a fighting game, so I'm not going to be talking about it. This game is designed around like a target, so you're either punching in the direction of the target of the enemy, or if you have a target on you, you're defending in that direction. When the game says rush in all caps, you can punch the opponent a bunch, which is kind of the first example of a combo system. Very basic, but still it's there. I would say Typhoon Gal is kind of more of a beat 'em up, honestly. But I think it's notable because it has a heavy focus on grappling, it has a heavy focus on throwing. Some sort of throw or a grappler character is kind of a common thing to see in most fighting games nowadays. International Karate comes out in 1985, and this is a really big game. From my understanding, it's the big reason there's a big martial arts boom in games during the 80s, as well as the karate movies that were coming out, obviously. It takes a lot from a game that came out earlier in 1985 called Way of the Exploding Fist. It plays better than that game from my experience, but they do look similar. In 1987, they released International Karate Plus, which is mainly notable because you could play with 3 characters on screen at the same time. This publisher was actually sued by Data East, who made Karate Champ. Data East sued them for saying that they were infringing on Karate Champ and it was basically a ripoff. Court ruled they weren't identical enough though, and said that the rules of a sport couldn't be monopolized in video games, which is fair. Galactic Warriors is a couple big firsts. It's the first mech fighting game. It's the first fighting game where you can select 3 different characters. You can pick from 3 different robots and they all look different. They play a bit different. Even if you don't know much about fighting games, you likely know what Street Fighter is. You've probably heard of it at least. If you do know about Street Fighter and you're maybe wondering why have I never heard about Street Fighter 1, there's a reason. This is because while this game is important in many ways, it's awkward, it's weird, it's kind of bad. You play as Ryu, or you play as Ken if a player 2 joins. There's 8 opponents in this game: Retsu, Geki, Joe, Mike, Lee, Gen, Birdie, Eagle, Adon, and Sagat. Ryu doesn't really look like himself yet, and Sagat's legs are very weird. You can actually pull off a few moves in this game. They weren't advertised on the cabinet any, so they were kind of secret. You can do a Hadouken, you can do a Shoryuken, and you can do a Hurricane Kick. These moves are a to pull off because you have to do this thing called negative edge. And let me pull up my stick to try to explain. What you have to do with negative edge is you have to punch, hold down the button, you need to keep it down, then do your movement, down, right, and let go. I don't really understand why it's like this, and it's really weird, and even knowing that, I still can only pull off moves like half the time, because sometimes you'll just press punch, it'll kick, Sometimes you press kick, it'll punch. The game is just not really consistent in how it reads your inputs. When the game came out, I actually had these pressure sensitive buttons, so the harder you pressed on punch or the harder you pressed on kick is how hard the hit would come out. Because of this, people broke the out of these machines, punched them really hard, and they eventually had to replace them with a 6-button layout that Capcom basically uses in almost every fighting game from this point on. I know I've said a lot of negative things about the first Street Fighter, but I really want to emphasize it's a really important game, and it led to 3 very important things. This game actually had a sequel plan called Street Fighter 89, which eventually turned into the first Final Fight, which became a big part of the Street Fighter series later on in the 90s. The director of this game and a planner left to join SNK and eventually create Fatal Fury as a spiritual successor. SNK would also become Capcom's main rival in the 90s in terms of fighting games. And of course, the team that made this would go on to make Street Fighter 2. Last Apostle Puppet Show, or in Japan, this game was actually the first game to use digitized sprites. It used motion capture animation and claymation to capture these characters. So from a technical perspective, this game's actually really cool. Unfortunately, it plays terribly. It's just kind of creepy. Like, I feel like these puppets could be in my nightmares. It also has a great insert coin noise. Let me just play that for y'all real quick. Honestly, the most notable thing about this game, and the only reason I wanted to talk about it, is when you hit people, it goes goon or it goes gagoon, which in Japan are like onomatopoeias for dramatic or explosive. So kind of like, you know, blam, kaboom. Hit Fighter is the second and more popular game to use digitized sprites. From my understanding, this game was a little big. It's kind of a joke now to a lot of people, but it was kind of big. There's 3 playable characters in it. You can actually hit people into the environment of the map, which I think this is one of the first fighting games to do that. It's aged rough, honestly, and it doesn't have a great reputation, but these are the early days of fighting games. Now in 1991, this is really when things start cooking, and we get what is considered one of the most important fighting games ever made. If you've ever played a fighting game, you're probably at least aware of Street Fighter 2. In terms of playable characters, we got Ryu, Ken, E Honda, Chun-Li, Blanca, Zangief, Guile, and Dalsim. There's also 4 unplayable bosses: Balrog, Vega, Sagat, and M. Bison. Each playable character in this game has a unique ending when you go through the arcade mode, and that ends up becoming a standard in the fighting game genre. This game holds up really well. Honestly, playing through the history of fighting games and getting to this game is such a relief. The animation is great, the backgrounds still hold up. Music is a massive improvement over Street Fighter 1. I mean, there's just some bangers in this soundtrack. I played through with Guile because in Street Fighter 2 World Warrior, the first Street Fighter 2 version, Guile is completely busted. There's some pretty infamous bugs in this game. I couldn't really pull them off, but they are very funny. He's also just crazy good because fighting game balance literally wasn't a thing at this point. They weren't thinking of the tier list when they made this one. This game very notably allows you to combo moves into each other, where you can cancel out a move into another one. What's funny is the developers of this game did not intend for combos. They didn't think that you could string moves in this way. It was just a happy accident. This game also has one of the first notable console ports with the 1992 SNES version. It plays pretty similar, and if I were a kid and weren't looking at them side by side, I would think this is the game at home. This would be the first of many Street Fighter 2 versions. We'll be talking about a lot of them. This game is kind of weird because it's following up Street Fighter 1 as a spiritual successor, but it came out after Street Fighter 2. SNK were way more focused on character and storyline and lore, and they wanted to have a kind of 80s action movie going on. The villain of the game, Geese Howard, is one of the most famous fighting game bad guys. He's awesome. I think it's because he's just a bad dude. The 3 playable characters, Terry, Andy, and Joe, are like the complete opposite. Each have their unique moves, and you may recognize Terry as that guy from Smash. or that guy coming to Street Fighter 6. The backgrounds, there are some great ones in this game. The weather will change round to round, which is really cool to see. The most unique mechanic in Fatal Fury and the series in general is the lane system. So in this game, there are 2 lanes. You can't really do much in the first one with them. It's something that would get more development as the series goes on, but it's cool to see them already thinking outside the box, trying to do some things different from Capcom. Similar to Street Fighter 1, it is hard to pull off moves in this game. It's a little finicky, it's a little precise, but it's still fun. It's still better than Street Fighter 1 for sure. 1992, this is the year we see the boom of fighting games. We see a lot of companies trying to capitalize off the success of Street Fighter 2. This is the first update to Street Fighter 2. There are some balance changes. This is essentially the first patch in a fighting game to tweak the balance. Most specifically, Guile is kind of tuned down, the bugs are fixed, and Ryu and Ken are made a lot better. You can also do mirror matches, so you can say go Ryu versus Ryu or Ken versus Ken. And the biggest change is that you can now play the bosses. You can play Balrog, you can play Vega, you can play Sagat, and you can play M. Bison. What's funny is the bosses seem like they're barely changed, so they're just completely busted. Don't get me wrong, they're really fun, so it doesn't matter. There's Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition on the Genesis, which actually came out after the next version of Street Fighter 2, so it includes an additional mode that lets you play it like that version. And now you can see the Street Fighter 2 web, it's already confusing. Like we're on the second game, we haven't done much, and it's already confusing. But the most important thing to know is Street Fighter 2 World Warrior, and now we're on Champion Edition and we can play the bosses. Shogun Warriors is notable as the first samurai fighting game, at least in this era. It predates some more popular franchises like Samurai Showdown and The Last Blade that SNK would use to popularize the samurai style. For some reason, there is a cyborg in this game who was a former Nazi soldier in World War II. Apparently this is because they originally wanted to have historical figures like Hitler. I don't know how anyone thought that was going to be a good idea or people were going to accept that in 1992. But, you know, good call not to at least include Hitler, but I don't know why we're including this Nazi at all. In my opinion, this game is just a pretty shameless Street Fighter 2 clone. I don't really have much nice to say about it. It feels cheap, it looks cheap. There is a stage with monkeys though, so I guess I can't really say much bad about it. Now this is the start of one of the most badass fighting game series ever. This game uses digitized sprites and they scanned in real life actors for their characters. And no, this game doesn't look great today. It hasn't held up well. Stuff like Street Fighter 2 has just aged a lot better visually. But you have to understand, at this time, this was really impressive. The most notable thing about Mortal Kombat is it has a lot of blood, a lot of gore, a lot of nasty, nasty fatalities. It sparked a lot of controversy at the time, eventually leading to the ESRB's creation. In fact, the SNES version even swapped the blood for sweat. Playable fighters in this game are Johnny Cage, Kano, Sub-Zero, Sonya Blade, Raiden, Liu Kang, and Scorpion. You can also fight Goro and Shang Tsung as bosses, as well as Reptile as a secret boss. A lot of things about this game are bold for the time period it came out. It introduces this 5-button layout where you actually have to press to block. It plays pretty slow, and Mortal Kombat 2 and 3 improve on it so much that it's just hard to go back to this one, honestly. But it started some awesome stuff, in my opinion. The Mortal Kombat franchise is great. I love the tower. I've always thought that was a really cool visual. And obviously this game was very successful. SNK's second fighting game after Fatal Fury was Art of Fighting. It actually takes place in the same universe as Fatal Fury. It's a prequel. The actual combat just doesn't feel good to play. I honestly think the first Fatal Fury plays better than this. There's a meter mechanic where you can kind of pull off special moves depending on where the meter's at. And I would say most notably, you can sidestep in this game. If you press your stick to the left a couple times, or you press it to the right a couple times, you'll sidestep, you'll dash a bit. That's not in like a Capcom fighting game until like 1997, so that's pretty cool to see. Dino Rex was made by Taito, and it uses stop motion animation for the dinosaurs. This would later be done in Primal Rage, which we'll talk about in part 2. Instead of just playing as dinosaurs, you play as human beings whipping the dinosaurs, and then if you lose, your person gets picked up by a dinosaur and killed. It was received terribly when it came out. It's being received terribly right now. It's just so lame. It looks terrible. The sound is terrible. Along with a game called Blondia, I don't know how you say it, which came out around the same time. These are the first weapon-based fighting games in the genre, really. This game was made by Incredible Technologies, who will eventually work with Capcom to make one of the worst fighting games ever made. Each button corresponds to a limb on the person's body. You can actually cut people's arms off, and if you do, and you cut both their arms off, they're just unable to defend and don't really have a weapon to use. You can also pull off a death move if you click all the buttons at the same time, which can one-shot the opponent. It's funny if you lose in this way because the character portrait actually has your head cut off, which I think is kind of cute. In terms of gameplay, it feels pretty bare bones. Honestly, the gimmick of like cutting off limbs and stuff, it gets old pretty quickly. But still, this is early on. It's cool to see, especially the art style, because nothing really looks like this at the time. Fatal Fury 2 comes out a little over a year later from the first Fatal Fury. It takes a lot of the foundation of Fatal Fury 1 and expands on it. It adds a lot more to the cast, including Mai, who is one of the most popular characters in fighting game history. It adds desperation moves, which are special moves that you can do when you're at low health. Lane system's back. It's a bit more expanded in this game. Now you can press 2 buttons to move to the other lane, and you can press 2 buttons to kick the opponent into the other lane. It's pretty fun, honestly, and this game has an update in 1993, which we'll talk about very soon.
I'm getting hacked.
Well, isolate the node and dump them on the other side of the router.
I'm trying. It's moving too fast.
So this is a hack of Street Fighter 2 that was done by a Taiwanese group. And I don't really know when it came out. It was just kind of showing up in arcades, apparently. It's completely bonkers. Plays at a higher speed. You can hit start at any time and switch characters. Most projectiles seem to home in on opponents, and Ryu and Ken get like 5 fireballs at the same time. Because of the faster playing speed, people were starting to like this version, and reportedly it led to Capcom seeing this and wanting to respond to it with their own faster version of Street Fighter 2. Well, here comes Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting. The faster playing speed is very welcome. It's very fun. There are some new special moves for most characters. There are some balance changes. There's a port of this to the SNES, and this is the version that I played growing up. And the Genesis version of Championship Edition actually has a turbo option, so it also kind of has this within it as well. This game is very fun. It's very good. It's probably one of the better Street Fighter 2s. We're still not to the best version of Street Fighter 2, in my opinion, but this version is very good. And it's important to know, I would say this is the most popular version of Street Fighter 2 for a very long time.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Holosseum, the martial arts world championship competition!
Holosseum was Sega's first fighting game after Street Fighter 2, and it's kind of odd. It was released exclusively for a Sega theater cabinet. And if you're wondering why you've never heard of it, it's because 3 games were made for it and they stopped making games for it. It displays the fighters holographically, and it gives this illusion of a 3D effect when you're playing it in person. But when you're emulating it, it kind of seems like a tech demo. But I will say the sprite work, the models are really impressive. We're gonna go about 3/4 of the way through 1993, and then we're gonna wrap it up for part 1. This is Konami's first fighting game after Street Fighter 2, and it's really disappointing, honestly. It's just super jank. The art style is just unappealing. It plays super stiff. It does not feel good at all. This coming from Konami, even though Yi Are Kung Fu was such a big success in the 80s, is honestly kind of sad. Dark Edge is really cool, and honestly, I have to give some credit to Sega for just being weird. They were just doing some weird things with their fighting games. Like, it feels like they were focused more on the technology, focused more on how to move the genre forward. But I kind of love that about it. Like this game, it's not true 3D, it's kind of a 3D fighting game, but it's not like a real 3D fighting game. It uses sprite scaling, so the sprites actually get smaller and larger as you go farther from the screen or closer to the screen. You can enter the foreground and the background, and the game honestly has really cool visuals. I think some of it even looks kind of cool now, like the reflections in the water look great. Fighter's history was actually put out by the people who made Karate Champ almost a decade earlier. And not to be reductive, but this is kinda as Street Fighter 2 clone as you get. Data East actually got sued by Capcom for this being a clone. The only thing unique about this game is that each character has a weak point, and if you hit it enough, they'll get stunned. I don't have much to say about World Heroes 2. It plays slightly faster. It seemed to play like slightly better. Adds a few new mechanics. I don't really have much to say. It just is so cheap. This game is really weird. It was this developer's only fighting game. It has some kind of cool art, honestly, but the music is just weirdly ominous. It doesn't fit at all. The main gimmick of this game is that you hold 2 attack buttons down and you launch yourself depending on how long you held those 2 buttons down. It's not particularly fun. The gimmick, in my opinion, is kind of lame even conceptually. Not to be mean, I just don't like to base an entire game around that doesn't really sound fun. This game has a system where you have 3 health bars that go down throughout the fight instead of it being 3 rounds like most fighting games. This is really cool because this is later done in Killer Instinct, later done in Vampire Survivor, but yeah, there was no sequel. This developer never made another fighting game. Yeah. Rival, this is the first fighting game made by SEGA AM2, which is important because they would eventually go on to make Virtua Fighter. I kind of like the animation, especially because there's nothing that looks like this fighting game wise around this time period. It plays almost aggressively average in my opinion. It's just very meat and potatoes fighting game. I haven't really said anything, but all of these recent SEGA fighting games I'm talking about, none of them really made a big impact, none of them really did well. So they're cool from a historical perspective, but just to give some context. Samurai Showdown is pretty awesome. Right off the bat, this game's movement feels better than a lot of fighting games around this time period. Part of this is because you have some of the SNK bells and whistles that they'd made up until this point. The game is more fast-paced than a lot of games around this time period and is less focused on combos and more like strong attacks, strong hits. I think the game is pretty fun, but SNK AI is ridiculous. In this game, I can barely get past like 1 or 2 fighters. Like I can get farther in Fatal Fury and Art of Fighting, but this I can just not get that far at all. But it's pretty fun, it's enjoyable, it's aged pretty well, and there's going to be a lot more Samurai Showdowns to come. This is actually 3 distinct games, not ports of the same game. So there's an SNES version, a Genesis version, and an NES version, which came out last. The NES version is very basic. The Genesis version is not great, it's kind of chunky. And I would say from my experience, the SNK is the best. The SNES version is probably the best of the 3. It has the best roster in my opinion. Another Street Fighter 2, this is Super Street Fighter 2, the new challengers. However, this one does add a ton of content to this game. Adds 4 new characters, T-Hawk, Fei Long, DJ, and Cammy. The game introduces a new HUD, portraits, stages. Everything's been improved basically. Some of the backgrounds look ridiculously good even now. There's an awesome new opening. One of my favorite fighting game openings ever, with Ryu gearing up to shoot a fireball at the screen. It looks so good. There's also a combo counter added in this game. It'll tell you how many hits you've got on a character. It'll tell you things like first attacks and reversals. Obviously most fighting games have this in them now. And this is kind of the start of that. There's 8 different color schemes, which is pretty cool. And overall, this just adds a ton of content to this game. But unfortunately, it reverts the speed back from Turbo. So the gameplay is slow. It's considered by a lot to be the worst version of Street Fighter 2. I kind of agree, just because even though it has some really amazing stuff, this is the last one I would actually pick up to play. However, we'll eventually get the turbo in this game. We'll get it slapped on here, but we won't be talking about that until part 2. This is essentially your Street Fighter 2 Turbo, but for Fatal Fury 2. The game has a faster speed, and because it's a dream match, which means they can put whatever they want in this game, it has previously unplayable bosses from Fatal Fury 1 and 2, and it adds Ryo from Art of Fighting, which was a hidden character. This is the first fighting game crossover when they add Art of Fighting to Fatal Fury. This was kind of a big deal. It was received very well and eventually inspired King of Fighters, which is one of the biggest fighting game franchises ever. This game is considered one of the best, at least early on in the Fatal Fury franchise, and it's easy to see why. It's really fun. It has a lot of content, especially for the time. Also notable for having a really bad English translation, which like a lot of these SNK games did back in the 90s. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. This is going to be it for part 1. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about what is truly considered the first 3D fighting game. If I miss anything that you really like or you really liked in this time period, please let me know in the comments. If you have any opinions on these games that we talked about, I'd love to hear them. So thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. Bye.